part of our military lecture series, and thank you so much for showing up today. My name's Ken Irvin. I'm the education coordinator at Guelph Museums, and before we start, I just want to thank the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada for being a partner in our military lecture series. And before we begin, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time. But more specifically, the Adirondack and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as the treaty lands and territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Haldimand Track and is part of the long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationship about the land, its history, and its peoples. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Tim Cook. This is your fourth time, I think, maybe fifth, I think at least fourth time speaking at Guelph Museums, and everyone has been a treat. I'm sure this one will be too. Tim is a chief historian and director of research at the Canadian War Museum. His best-selling books have won multiple awards, including 4 Ottawa Book Awards for literary nonfiction, 2 C.P. Stacey Awards for the best book in Canadian military history. In 2008, he won the J.W. Defoe Prize for At the Sharp End, and again in 2018 for Vimy, The Battle and the Legend. Shock Troops won the 2009 Charles Taylor Prize for literary nonfiction. Tim is a frequent commentator in the media. You probably will hear him around Remembrance Day coming up. And he's a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. So thank you again, Tim, for coming and joining us today.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's great to be back, as Ken said, and it's been my great pleasure to work in a museum, the Canadian War Museum, for 22 years now. And so I love museums. I love coming back here, in particular, tremendous history, and this is a great program as well. And nice to see some old friends as part of this. Now let's just see if this works. So I'm going to be talking about my new book today, The Good Allies, and this is my 19th book. And I've been occasionally asked which one is my favorite. It's a bit like asking which of my kids I like the best or my favorite. It sort of depends on the day, but what I say about the books often is that they remind me of a time in my life. You know, I've been doing this now for 25 years or so. And each of the books usually tries to answer a question of some sort. My Vimy book, I was interested in exploring that idea of why did people talk about Vimy as the birth of the nation? What did that mean if we were confederated before that? How did we remember the war? The Secret History of Soldiers was about exploring how soldiers coped and endured and how they made sense of war and how they killed and how they were killed on the battlefield. And so this one, I won't go through all 19 books and what they are, but this one very much, I wanted to explore the Canadian-American relationship during the Second World War, or World War II, as it is often said in the United States. And I had a number of reasons to write this book. A prominent one being that I visited the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is a fabulous museum, really great. That's the one with Tom Hanks and Spielberg associated with it. Ken, you'll shudder. They have more money than God there. They're just building everything under the sun. Amazing AI technology, films and everything. And I went through that museum pretty carefully, and throughout the museum there are 2 references to Canada. Just 2. I thought, well, that's the way it is. When the United States is talking about World War II, they're playing for keeps. That one matters. Partially, I have a theory on this, is why the Great War is so important in Canada. There's lots of reasons for that, but partially because in the United States, World War I doesn't really matter as much, so we don't have to fight against the kind of cultural tide there. But I left there thinking, Americans should have a better sense of what we did during World War II. They should have a better sense of how we were reliable allies. And I also felt it wasn't up really to Americans to write that history. It's our job. We're a grown-up country. It's our job to tell our story. So I came back and I thought, well, I'll write something. A couple of other books intervened, but I returned to it. And I should say, cards on the table, I started this about 2 years ago after Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. I was here talking about that, my medical history of the Great War. Typically, I finish a book, I give myself a day off, and then I start working on the next one, which drives my family a little batty, but they are aware of this obsession. Nonetheless, when I began to work on this, I realized it would come out in September of 24. I wanted it to come out in September of 24. I'm not unaware of the fact that there would be a contentious election and that a lot of hard words would be hurled at each candidate and each party and everyone else. And I thought it might be a good idea, a small, tiny little contribution to the discussion, if we could talk about Canada and the United States in a positive manner, as I think this story is. It's not, I hope it's not, patriotic history, hand over your heart history. Like Canada made mistakes during the Second World War. The Allies made mistakes, but this is a war that had to be fought, and it's a war that had to be won. And there are many commonalities, partnerships, and alliances that I want to speak to tonight. And the North Americans, Canada and the United States, really do play a key role, I argue, in the Allied victory. Now, it also needs to be said that for much of our history, we were not good neighbors. Right? Think of the American invasion of Canada in 1775. Think of the War of 1812, the Battle of Queenston Heights here, where the Americans were hurled back, and the death of Brock here. Think of the 1830s and the 1840s with cross-border raids, Canada into the United States into Canada. Think about the Civil War, where a very fraught period where Canada, or British North America, was desperate to stay neutral, but nonetheless harbored Confederate agents and soldiers who made cross-border raids, much to the anger of the Lincoln administration, and rightly so. It was a dangerous period, and we really don't become those good neighbors, I would argue, until about the early 20th century, when through a series of cautious diplomacy, entwined trade, and growing friendship, we begin to find ways to navigate that difficult process of living together in the Northern Hemisphere. It still wasn't easy, and as part of my research, I was able to look at some of the original plans for the invasion of each country that were established in the 1920s. It's quite remarkable if you think about it. These are not the actual plans, they're graphic representations. Canada's plan, Defense Scheme Number 1, involved sending mechanized forces across the border to seize key cities and towns, to slowly engage in a fighting retreat, waiting for the Royal Navy to sail across the Atlantic and to fire American cities, and maybe even, it was hoped, the Australians would send an expeditionary force across and invade California. It's a pretty ambitious plan, considering the Australians didn't know about this, the British didn't want to do it, and we had no mechanized forces. But the American plan was a little more coherent insofar as they had more armed forces. They were going to capture Victoria and Vancouver. On the West Coast, they're going to take Halifax by dousing it in chemical weapons, aerially dispersed from bombers. They would have captured Winnipeg and then marched on Ottawa. Now, to be fair, those plans were unlikely, and they were largely shelved by the 1930s. And I think it's fair to say that countries have to engage, their armed forces have to engage in these types of plans. But it does give you a sense that this is a potentially, always difficult period. Nonetheless, by the 1930s, there are a few countries in the world, especially those sharing a 9,000-kilometer border, that have been so accommodating and generous to each other in matters of trade and politics and defense. And the key turning point, I would argue, to this relationship And it's amazing, many in this room will know this. You talk to Americans, their key trading partner for almost all of the 20th century was Canada. Japan overtook us, I think, in the late 1990s at one point. But we are still, I think, number 2, and that's really quite remarkable. So, this is part of the long history that goes back to the Second World War. And a key relationship here is between William Lyon Mackenzie King, our Prime Minister, and President Franklin Roosevelt. And it was really fun as a historian to explore these two men, to understand them better. I went to the Roosevelt archives, was able to read a tremendous amount of his correspondence, and as well Mackenzie King, a perplexing figure in our history, our longest serving prime minister, of course. A bit of a joke, I imagine those of you who are older were taught about Mackenzie King, who rarely did anything in his long career, was always leading from the rear, and of course the seances and the spiritualism and the taking guidance from dead politicians and his passed away mother and his dead dog, right? There's that side of Mackenzie King. That's not untrue. That's who he is. But having gotten to know Mackenzie King over the years, I've also found him to be a deeply lonely man. You see that in his diary. He never married. He had no children. He had a tremendous workload, the crushing workload of a prime minister, but very few real friends. And so he committed his thoughts, his anxieties often to his diary, his famous diary that he kept his whole life, or most of his adult life. 30,000 pages long. I've read thousands of pages now. It's a fascinating document. And in there is every interaction with almost anyone he ever met. Great insight into politicians and Canadians and international visitors. But also, that's where he poured out. It was a cathartic release for him. That's where he poured out his fear and anxiety. And, he didn't write that for Tim Cook in 2022 or 2023. It's not really fair that I and others have read that. I wouldn't want someone reading my diary. Nonetheless, it is there, and it provides great insight. And what we see from this is when Mackenzie King comes back into power in late 35, early 36, he makes it his mission to strengthen ties with the United States. This is really important to him. Of course, Canada is still in the depths of the Depression. Things are grim. Our military has withered away. Our economy is in ruins. We need the United States, and we begin to forge trade deals. And yet our relationship is still, if we think of the military alliance, very much with Britain. We're a British dominion within the British Commonwealth, as it's now called, but really everyone calls it the British Empire. And that's our key relationship, at least for our armed forces. And Mackenzie King understands that we have to keep those close ties to Britain, but we also need to do a better job in reaching out to the United States. And this is a wonderful cartoon called Two Kinds of Frontiers. You see Mackenzie King, Roosevelt over their shoulders. We see a lot of sort of prosperity and trade and presumably crowds meeting and talking and doing whatever. And then in the foreground here, we've got any European frontier, marching soldiers, aggression, bellicosity, right? This is a world that is moving towards war, perhaps not unlike the world that we live in today. And Hitler is on the rise, and Mussolini, and Japan has invaded China in 1931 and more fully in 1937. And yet our greatest shield, which is not represented here, but is important to remember, I think, is our geography, right? That is critical for us. We are protected largely from the madness that is happening in Europe and, I suppose, in China. And interestingly, King and Roosevelt were both appeasers. They both thought that Hitler could be bought off. They both believed that there was a goal from Nazi Germany that was not all-out war. They were deeply wrong, of course. And this image on the left is a fascinating one at the Library Archives Canada, because Mackenzie King visits Hitler in 1937, and he goes there to meet him and to try to convince him to choose the path of peace. And almost everyone said, don't go. I mean, one, Canada doesn't matter, so don't go. But two, don't go. You can't trust him. He's a fox. He will tell you things and you will believe them. And Mackenzie King went, and Hitler told him he was a man of peace, and it's gut-wrenching reading King's diary about this, because he believes it, and he calls him that. Hitler's misunderstood. He's a mystical, spiritual man, and he loves his mom, and I love my mom, and he's not a man of war. So grossly misunderstands the nature of this monster. But to his credit, I wanted to show this image on the right at the Berlin Games, everyone doing the Nazi salute. Mackenzie King is not there. So I think at least he had some sense of